It's Friday, it's 12:15 and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. This week, misogynistic and offensive comments about Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner are condemned.
Being demeaning, offensive to women in Parliament, it can only deter women who might be considering standing for election to the detriment of us all.
I hope he's also sent a clear message that there's no place for sexism and misogyny or looking down on people because of where they come from in his party, in this House or in modern Britain.
I exchanged messages with the Right Honourable Lady over the weekend, and I repeat what I said to her. There could be absolutely no place for such behaviour or such expression in this House.
The human cost of addiction to cosmetic procedures.
I'd have the procedure, I'd get really excited about it, feel that rush, that elation, and then I'd realise that I still wasn't happy, and then I would crash, and then I would really crash.
We do, in Her Majesty's name and in obedience to Her Majesty's commands, prorogue this Parliament.
And another parliamentary session comes to an end ahead of the Queen's speech next month. Let's start here in Westminster with Susan Hume. Susan, there was a lot going on this week with various pieces of legislation going through Parliament and the cost of living crisis, of course, again, at the top of the political agenda. But as we heard in the headlines this week, there was also a lot of discussion about the culture in Westminster, in Parliament, and accusations of sexism and misogyny. How's this week unfolded?
Yeah, as you say, the spotlight has again been on the behaviour of some MPs and allegations of a pretty toxic attitude towards women among some of them. It all flared up at the start of the week after a story in the Mail on Sunday about Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner. It quoted a couple of unnamed, anonymous Conservative MPs who claimed that Angela Rayner, when she'd been standing in at Prime Minister's questions for Keir Starmer, that she'd been flashing her legs to distract Boris Johnson. They suggested that was in an attempt to distract him because she couldn't match his Oxford Union-style debating skills. Well, there was a huge outcry about this, with accusations that it was extremely sexist and pretty snobbish as well. And it was something that the Speaker addressed first thing on Monday afternoon.
Before we start today's business, I want to say something about the article in yesterday's Mail on Sunday about the Right Honourable Member for Ashton-under-Lyne. I said to the House last week, in response to a point of order about a different article, that I took the issue of media freedom very seriously. It is one of the building blocks of our democracy. However, I share the views expressed by a wide range of members, including, I believe, the Prime Minister, that yesterday's article was reporting substantiated claims of misogynistic and offensive. Those are what we believe. I express my sympathy to the Right Honourable Member for Ashton-under-Lyne for the subject to this type of comment. In being demeaning, offensive to women in Parliament, it can only deter women who might be considering standing for election to the detriment of us all.
And claims of sexism and misogyny continued actually through the week. It was also raised at PMQs on Wednesday, and the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, had also summoned the editor of the Mail on Sunday and the political editor who wrote the story.
Yes, he did. There was a wee bit of a backlash, actually, against the Speaker for that, who felt that people felt he'd gone a bit too far. Some people did anyway, trying to hold the journalists up. And in fact, the editor of the Mail on Sunday declined to come along, citing freedom of the press. But as you say, it did all flare up again at Prime Minister's questions. I mean, just before Prime Minister's questions, there was quite a bizarre development where it emerged that some Conservative women MPs had raised an issue at a meeting of Conservative MPs the day before, saying that one male Conservative MP they'd both spotted looking at pornography actually in the Commons chamber.
No, it's astonishing.
Really. It is astonishing, quite bizarre. There was possibly a slight reference to that by the Green MP Caroline Lucas, who had a question for the Prime Minister about the whole behaviour of MPs and how it was dealt with. However, the Angela Rayner story was addressed by all the leaders of the main parties at the start, with Angela Rayner actually in her seat next to Keir Starmer for it.
I know the Prime Minister will have whipped his backbenchers to scream and shout, and that's fine. That's fine. But I hope he's also sent a clear message that there's no place for sexism and misogyny or looking down on people because of where they come from in his party, in this House, or in modern Britain.
Mr. Speaker, well, let me first of all say, in response to what the right honourable gentleman has said about sexism and misogyny, that I exchanged messages with the right honourable lady over the weekend, and I repeat what I said to her. There could be absolutely no place for such behaviour or such expression in this House, and we should treat each other, Mr. Speaker, frankly, with the respect that each other deserves.
Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Leader of the Opposition and the absolutely disgusting misogyny and sexism that was witnessed by the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party? That should shame us all, what has happened over the last few days.
56 members of this House are under investigation for sexual misconduct, and that includes 3 of his cabinet ministers. The Prime Minister has just rightly said that there can be no place for sexism and misogyny in this House. So can he now confirm whether he considers that sexual harassment, apparently unlike bullying and lying, is grounds for dismissal under the Ministerial Code?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, sexual harassment is intolerable, and it's quite right that members should now have a procedure by which they can bring that to the attention of the House authorities, and I think that's a good thing, and of course it's grounds for dismissal.
And alongside the discussion on sexism and misogyny, Keir Starmer also based most of his questions around the issue of the cost of living with the Prime Minister.
Yeah, that's right. Although the questions about sexism were perhaps the most dramatic, it was a lot about the cost of living. I'm not sure that we got a great deal further with it. There were no hints of a great big giveaway from the government or anything like that. But those sort of problems about energy bills, food bills for families was the main focus of the whole thing. I think a lot of Prime Minister's questions, frankly, reflected the fact we have got local elections coming up. Put it this way, there was a question about bin collection.
Yes, well, it was a sort of classic of its type in that sense. Now, you mentioned rising energy costs. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is also playing an important part in those rising energy costs around the world.
Yeah, and we had a statement from the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, early in the week. He came along to update MPs about what seemed to be very heavy Russian losses, and he was talking about what more Britain would be doing to support Ukraine. So there was detail about numbers and about weaponry and about armoured vehicles to help. But I thought there were, 2 months since that first invasion. I thought there was more of a focus, particularly from MPs' questions about the long term. So, for example, questions about what will success in Ukraine look like? Is it just stopping this invasion, or is it pushing Russia back from the areas that they took, like Crimea, back in 2014? And other questions about what this means for Britain, for defence spending, for what we should be doing. Great deal of emphasis on that in the Commons as well.
It is our assessment that approximately 15,000 Russian personnel have been killed during their offensive. Alongside the death toll or the equipment losses, and in total, a number of sources suggest that to date, over 2,000 armoured vehicles have been destroyed or captured. We anticipate that this next phase of the invasion will be an attempt by Russia to occupy further the Donbass and connect via Mariupol the Crimea. And so it is urgent that we in the international community ensure Ukraine gets the aid and weapons it so much needs.
our leadership in NATO could be at risk as Britain falls behind allies in responding to this Ukraine invasion. More than a dozen European countries are now rebooting security plans and defence spending, but the UK has not yet done either. Can I urge him, therefore, to revisit the integrated review defence spending, reform military procurement and rethink his army cuts?
We need to know what will NATO look like and how will Western Europe, or Europe including many of its new members, contain Putin after all this has passed, because we have a man who has clearly been involved in an illegal invasion of a country, war crimes against the Ukrainian people, and how are we going to live with that neighbour in Europe should he still remain?
What does success in Ukraine look like? Are we doing enough to prevent Ukraine from losing, but not enough to make sure that they win? What is our strategy? Is it to push Russia back from the pre-February lines, or indeed liberate the entire Donbass region? If it's in Europe's wider security interest to see Putin humiliated in Ukraine, then the entire mainland must be liberated. That must be our strategic aim.
For my part, Mr. Speaker, I want Putin not only beyond the pre-February boundaries. He invaded Crimea illegally, he invaded Donetsk illegally, and he should comply with international law and, in the long run, leave Ukraine.
The Secretary of State highlights in his statement Russia's apparent reduced ambition to consolidate in the east of Ukraine around Donbass, and through Mariupol tried to secure a land bridge to Crimea. Can he reassure the House today that enduring economic pressure and further military support will continue to frustrate this Russian ambition of aggression?
As Russia flounders on the battlefields of Ukraine due to the bravery of the Ukrainians, President Putin has raised the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons. Can my right honourable friend ensure that the government and our allies does everything it can to deter the President Putin from taking this disastrous step?
Is he concerned, though, that if Putin is allowed to retain the territories in the south and east that he has invaded, that he will claim that and be able to claim that to some extent as a kind of victory? And in that context, what does he think of the comments of retired General Philip Breedlove, the former NATO commander in Europe today, who said now might be the time to at least consider, by NATO or a coalition of the willing, troops on the ground in the north and west of Ukraine so that more Ukrainian resources are freed up to fight in the south and east?
Same state.
It's definitely a valid suggestion insofar as if we were to fast forward to a frozen conflict where 80% of Ukraine was still, sovereign Ukraine, then it is entirely up for Ukraine to decide who it wants to invite onto its territory and for what purposes.
So that was a debate, obviously, about the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which looks like it is going to last a lot longer than perhaps people had first anticipated. Thank you very much for now, Susan. We're going to go to the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, to Holyrood, to our Scotland political correspondent there, Andrew Kerr. Andrew, a big story at Westminster has been this High Court ruling on the discharging of untested COVID patients into care homes. It's also been featuring in Holyrood.
Yes, that's right, Joe. The UK government have been defending their handling of the early stages of the pandemic after that High Court ruling on the policies of discharging patients into care homes that was said to be unlawful. Now, there's, of course, a separate legal system here in Scotland, and here at First Minister's Questions, Scottish Labour were asking the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, about that. Labour said that 75 known positive cases had been transferred to care homes. They said that was shameful, unforgivable and criminal. Now, the First Minister was saying she will consider the judgment down south, but first of all, here's the Scottish Labour leader, Anas Sarwar.
Does the First Minister accept that her decision to send untested and positive patients into care homes in Scotland was unlawful, unreasonable, irrational and cost lives?
First Minister. No, I don't accept that. We're obviously aware of the ruling at the High Court yesterday regarding decisions made by the UK Secretary of State for England. The priority of all of us during this pandemic has been to save lives at all points, and we have sought to take the best decisions based on the best scientific and clinical evidence that we had at any given time. All nations developed guidance based on what we understood at the time. The guidance in Scotland is broadly similar to the guidance that was in place in England, but not identical. There were some differences in the versions of the guidance. One of the things that our guidance emphasised from the 13th of March and the 26th of March 2020 was that residents should remain in their rooms so far as possible and routine visiting should be suspended. We also required isolation from the 26th of March of anyone discharged to a care home who had been in contact with COVID cases, even if they were not displaying symptoms. It is right and proper that these matters are fully scrutinised by the public inquiry.
Now, Joe, a judge will lead that public inquiry here in Scotland. The terms of reference have already been published. The First Minister ended her remarks to the Labour leader, saying the human consequences of this were embedded in her soul, but of course her government's actions should still be subject to scrutiny.
Well, Andrew, we've already been discussing the issue of misogyny at Westminster. It's been causing huge concern this week. What's been the impact of that story in Scotland?
That's right, Joe. Huge concern about that down in Westminster with that story about Angela Rayner, about the behaviour of male MPs as well. And of course, men's attitude to women in politics and public life is also being discussed here in the Scottish Parliament. And this week, a leading QC told MSPs on the Justice Committee that she was shocked by the evidence that she was hearing about misogyny. Helena Kennedy has been asked by the Scottish Government to see if there were gaps in the law when it came to reviewing the Hate Crime Act, which was introduced last year. Ministers are drawing up plans, perhaps for new laws, to crack down on the abuse of women and girls.
Every single woman or group that appeared in front of us was saying something has to be done. And that's the message that I come to all of you with, which is that there is a very strong sense amongst women in the Scottish public that something has to be done about the high level of harassment, misogyny that they experience in their daily round, and that this is affecting girls and women in their lives, and that it really does, in a very serious way, undermine their sense of self-confidence, self-worth, and the ways in which they conduct their own lives and what their own aspirations are.
We might not be those men who have said those things that you're saying or done those things, but, you know, we've all been men for all our lives, and we've been younger men, and maybe been in situations where we could have done more, and I think that's what pieces like this piece of work are important, and they're important about changing you know, the culture and the society we live in and challenging men, and I think we've got a big role in that, so I want to thank you for that. And actually, on a personal note, I became dad to a daughter in the last year, and I've you know, when you were actually speaking there about some of the things that, you know, you were getting reported that people were saying to others outside nightclubs, for example, it sent shivers down my spine, you know, to think, you know, that, you know, if we don't do something to change that culture in society, that, you know, someone that I love so much could be in that position as well. So I think it changes your own mindset as well, but thank you for challenging us.
Of course, Joe, that is an issue that will be discussed more and more here at Holyrood and, of course, Westminster.
Absolutely. Now, the other big discussion, ongoing one, is about cost of living. The Cabinet were asked to come up with ideas at Westminster for how to save money by not spending any more. What was being debated around this in the Scottish Parliament?
Yes, Joe, the squeeze continues, of course. Food and fuel prices continue to go up and wages stagnant as well. I think the focus this week here at Holyrood in particular was about reducing the cost of the school day for low-income families, looking in particular at free school meals and uniform grants. For example, it was a Scottish Government-led debate, and MSPs from all the parties were putting forward their thoughts on how to improve the situation. It did end up being quite argumentative, though, with blame being apportioned by the different parties for the current situation. We start with Labour's Pam Duncan-Glancy with this question to the Education Secretary.
Does the Cabinet Secretary recognise that 3 out of 4 of the child poverty targets will be missed next year?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it's very important to recognise, as we did last month, the important work that has been done by this Parliament, but as was also set out, the difficulties that we will continue to have tackling child poverty and indeed all poverty and inequality in this Scotland as we face the welfare cuts from Westminster and the universal credit £20 cut is just but one example. That does make it exceptionally difficult for us to meet our targets, but we are determined to do so.
The truth is
that many of the problems we're talking about today have been created on the SNP's watch. While it might be politically convenient to scream Tories every time the going gets tough, it's SNP cuts to local government budgets that have seen education squeezed and our schools left so short of resources that they sometimes even struggle to function. We've heard at the Education Committee only this past week that many schools are using attainment funding just to keep the show on the road. I know myself, having been lucky enough to be educated before the SNP came to power, that schools used to have enough resources not to have to charge young people for the basics.
This objective of poverty-proofing our schools and reducing the cost of the school day is at the heart of the Scottish Government's agenda, and in particular the Butte House Agreement reached last year by the Greens and the SNP. Capping the cost of school uniforms via statutory guidance, for example, is a policy I was proud to take from the Scottish Greens manifesto into the programme for government. Across far too many schools and council areas, there are unnecessarily prescriptive uniform requirements and exclusive agreements with certain suppliers which only serve to drive up the cost of uniforms, putting greater burden on low income and on larger families.
Now, Joe, many of these issues and more are featuring in the local council election campaign, with that vote taking place on Thursday, of course. So here at Holyrood, First Minister's Questions has been moved to a day earlier on Wednesday, allowing MSPs to go out and campaign.
Andrew, thank you very much. Andrew Kerr there at Holyrood for us. Let's return to Westminster and Susan Hume. We discussed last week the government's plan to send some asylum seekers to Rwanda to try and stop the flow of people making that crossing over the Channel. On Monday, the House of Lords discussed this issue. What happened?
Yeah, so there was some unhappiness in the House of Lords, as you might imagine, because it has come in from a lot of criticism, this policy. As you suggest, the ministers hope that it will help deter people from making that dangerous crossing across the Channel. But what would happen was, if people do arrive, they would immediately be put on a plane to Rwanda. Their cases would be looked at in Rwanda. If their application for asylum was successful, they'd be allowed to settle in Rwanda. And if it's not successful, they'd be sent somewhere else back home if it could be established where that was. However, they would not be allowed to come to the UK. Ministers think that will be a very popular, very successful policy. However, critics say Rwanda is not the best place to send possibly vulnerable asylum seekers. It has its own issues with human rights and its human rights record, and doesn't really have the capacity to look after asylum seekers either. So in the House of Lords, there was a lot of that criticism. And they were also pretty fed up that the government has arranged it by means not of a treaty, which Parliament would have to approve, but by means of something called a Memorandum of Understanding, which the government can do off its own bat.
Why an MOU and not a treaty? Didn't hear the answer to that. Secondly, why did the government seek PII, public interest immunity, to protect the secrecy of the pushbacks policy and the fact that the policy could never have been used against asylum seekers? And finally, we hear from the press, from parts of the press, that the Home Secretary thinks criticism of the Rwandan deal is xenophobic. So would the Noble Lady, the Minister, like to comment on the US State Department report on Rwanda for just last year, reporting significant human rights issues, including credible reports of unlawful or arbitrary killings by the government, forced disappearance by the government, torture or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment by the government, and 10 other violations of that magnitude?
My Lords, I don't know why not a treaty, but it seems that it was appropriate to have an MOU, and I'm very happy to write to Noble Lords with further detail on that. Noble Lords, I hope, will appreciate that I haven't had much notice of this question, so I'm not going to blag my way through it, and I will write to the Noble.
Amnesty International's latest annual report sets out that in Rwanda, violations of the rights to a fair trial, freedom of expression and privacy continued, alongside enforced disappearances, allegations of torture and use of excessive force. And this came following the UK government's own concerns raised in July 2021 in the UN Human Rights Council. In the context of these human rights concerns in Rwanda, it's deeply worrying that the UK government has now decided that Rwanda is a safe third country.
Well, what I'd say to the Right Reverend Prelate is that obviously Rwanda has come on a very upward positive trajectory since the genocide way back when. It is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It has great equality record at the moment, certainly in Parliament, and it houses 130,000 asylum seekers.
If it were a treaty, it would have to be registered at the United Nations, and there might be some embarrassment in seeking to register a memorandum of understanding governing an arrangement clearly totally inconsistent with the Refugee Convention, which the United Nations is responsible for.
I would just go back to the point about both the EU and the UNHCR engaging with Rwanda on the relocation of asylum seekers and refugees.
Lords, the Minister did say that there'd be ample opportunity to debate this issue.
Yes. When?
We haven't got any ample opportunity. What assurance can we have? There are so many points of detail, my lords, which we don't have the answer to. It's just a con trick by the government, and I think the government should come clean on the details before they remove a single person to Rwanda.
Yes.
Well, my lords, I am not trying to con anyone, and the beauty of your lordship's house is that it is self-governing, and debates can be brought to your lordship's house for full discussion.
Well, some heated debate and scrutiny there for the Minister in the House of Lords over that policy of sending some asylum seekers to Rwanda. On a completely different subject, Susan, there was an interesting debate or question and answer session in the Health Select Committee, who were hearing evidence on the impact of body image on mental and physical health.
Yeah, of course, this is a huge issue, particularly for young people, but not exclusively for young people. So particularly with social media and online, people are bombarded with these idealised pictures of celebrities and influencers, often touched up photos, actually. And people have this feeling that they need to compete or aspire to those kind of standards. And they did hear a very powerful testimony from one young woman who said that from the age of 5 she'd felt this pressure to look like a Disney princess, and then when she was older she'd had round after round of cosmetic procedures to try and achieve that, but that she never felt good, she never felt right. So, as I say, very powerful testimony.
The procedures as such, they started at the age of 18. And I remember I was flicking through Vogue magazine, and there was an article in there about how to disguise your gummy smile with fillers. And where I felt I had a gummy smile, immediately I looked for a local practitioner because I wanted to change that aspect of myself. And it was just so, even then, you know, that there was no one around, it must have been early 2000s, that really had any, I didn't know anyone that had those procedures, but it was just something that was accessible for me. I had the procedure done, and it kind of just spiraled from there, really.
When you were going to get these treatments done, how did you find that process? Was there anyone that ever said to you, I don't think you need this, or have you thought about kind of the wider counselling that you might need? Were you consulted properly when you went for those treatments?
If they couldn't give me what I wanted, it wasn't difficult for me to find someone that could. And I remember I remember that situation happening, and I found this. It was an esthetician, and they had a huge following on Instagram. Very glossy pictures of women with these kind of those princess looks almost, and it looked so glossy and I don't know, it really drew me in, and I thought, well, that's what I want. That they'll give me what I want. And I remember going and finding this place, and I was expecting to go into this really nice clinic, and it was going to be really, you know, something over the top, and it was this really grotty room that was filthy. You had to walk through this really filthy hairdressers to go in there, and she just didn't really, I think I had about 10-15 minutes with her, and she just said, oh, what do you want? It was I was just like, I want my cheeks, this, and she just did it. She just did it without any questioning at all.
On the point of people seeking validation for their looks, you spoke about how you always thought that, you know, if you do one procedure, things would be better, and another that would. How did you feel in that realisation once the procedure had been done? and how much did that impact different areas of your life?
So what would happen is I'd have the procedure, I'd get really excited about it, feel that rush, that elation, and then I'd realise that I still wasn't happy, and then I would crash, and then I would really crash, because I just thought, oh gosh, it's just another thing. It's another thing that hasn't worked. Sorry. So yeah, you just find that it's just never ending. It's never ending, and you get to a point where you're like, well, if that doesn't work, then I just don't know how I can live like this. I can't live like this, you know. And I've got to those points in my life where it's just it's almost like a rock bottom moment.
Well, that was very personal and powerful testimony, as you said, Susan. We'll come back to you later on in the programme. We're going to talk to our reporter, Amelia Belly, who can tell us what's been happening in the Welsh Parliament. Hello to you. The efficiency of the Welsh Government was scrutinised this week in First Minister's questions. Tell us about it.
Hello, Jo. Yes, it was. So the Conservative Group leader, Andrew R.T. Davies, reminded First Minister Mark Drakeford of his pledge to stand down before the next election, and that essentially the clock is ticking for him to both publish and pass legislation. In particular, he honed in on the agriculture bill, which will set out what farming looks like in Wales for years to come. Now, that was supposed to be published in the spring. Andrew R.T. Davies said that deadline has passed, and he called for urgent action.
First Minister, there is a crisis. Fertiliser, which you need to grow crops, is now £900 to £1,000 a tonne. It is normally about £300 to £350 a tonne. Wheat, the key component of making bread, is north of £300 a tonne. It normally trades at £140 to £150 a tonne. Beef is at £4.40 a kilo. It normally trades at £3.40 to £3.60. I could go on. I like to think I've got my hand on the pulse on this one. And there is a growing storm. There is a growing storm happening that if the government doesn't respond, we will reap a very meagre harvest indeed, and that will play out on the shelves of this country. We need to see the government action when it comes to this particular agenda item. We're not seeing it at the moment. We're seeing delay in bringing this bill forward. As I said, I welcome the delay if it is about making the bill more food security conscious. But from what the Minister has said in her previous statements, that doesn't seem to be the case.
There isn't a crisis in food in our shops. There are some very significant issues that have to be addressed in fertiliser. I entirely agree with what the member said on that. And those things can only be properly addressed on a four-nation basis. It's why my colleague Leslie Griffiths has such regular meetings with the Secretary of State, George Eustace, and counterparts in Scotland, and when there is an administration in Northern Ireland as well. I believe there's a meeting of that sort scheduled for tomorrow, and many of the issues that the Leader of the Opposition has highlighted will be discussed there on that four-nation basis.
Now, Mark Drakeford said that that delay is also so that they can account for disruption to the global food supply chain exacerbated by Ukraine, but that the bill can be expected in September.
Now, there was a lot of attention, Amelia, paid to waiting times in the Welsh NHS too.
Yes, that comes after a set of figures published last week that showed that waiting times for A&E in particular are being broken in terms of how long people are having to wait. It's also worth noting that in Wales at the moment, around 1 in 5 people are on a waiting list. So this week, the Welsh Government published their plans to bring that down. In particular, they made a pledge that by 2025, nobody will be waiting longer than a year for treatment. But opposition parties questioned whether that pledge was ambitious enough.
Our targets are clear that nobody should wait more than a year by 2025, but there is an interim target, and that is that we should eliminate the number waiting for longer than 2 years in most specialities by March 2023. So that's the way you can hold us to account this time next year. And I ask you to hold me account in the sense that, you know, I'll be holding my officials to account and we'll be holding house boards to account. So I think it's absolutely clear we've built these targets alongside the house boards. They are telling us that they can hit these targets. It's really important now that we hold their feet to the fire on that.
I've received some comments today from Cymru versus Arthritis, worried about the targets that are in relation to cutting waiting times for most specialities rather than all. Now, given how long orthopaedic waiting times are, this is one heck of a get-out clause for Welsh Government. We'll sort waiting times except those people who are waiting the longest. I would appreciate an undertaking to publish targets for all specialities, but recognising that the challenge is greater for some specialities.
Now, £1 billion has been earmarked by the Welsh Government for COVID recovery, but waiting lists were already an issue before the pandemic hit. So an acknowledgement this week that it will take years to bring those waiting lists down.
Well, let's stick with the subject of health, Amelia, because the Health Minister has been under increased scrutiny elsewhere this week.
Yes, that's right. So Eluned Morgan was banned from driving last month after she received her 4th conviction for speeding. Now, this has been investigated by the Standards Commissioner, who is the Senate's behaviour watchdog. His report has been seen by BBC Wales ahead of being published. And in it, some of his conclusions are that if the speeding were a one-off offence, some people could see it as not particularly serious. But he adds that when it's taken with her 3 previous convictions for speeding, it demonstrates a disregard for the law. He concludes that the Minister has broken the Senate's rules on behaviour. Now, these findings aren't public yet, and when they are published, they will need to be agreed by the Senate's Standards Committee, and only then might the Minister face some sanctions. She, too, can appeal the charges. She is not commenting on this report either yet, but seeing as the First Minister has previously called for the Prime Minister's resignation for breaking his own COVID rules, saying you can't be a lawmaker and a lawbreaker, some might question Eluned Morgan's position. Now, we asked Mark Drakeford for his response to this report, and he said he sees no moral equivalence between the two cases, and that as far as he's concerned, the matter is closed, although perhaps it could undermine future attacks by Labour towards the Conservatives over Partygate.
Amelia Belly there at the Senate. Thank you very much. Let's return to Westminster and talk to Susan Hume again. This week has been the last of this session. Time is flying with Parliament proroguing on Thursday. As we mentioned earlier in the programme, bills that have been before the Commons and Lords have got to go through by now. There's been a lot going on.
There certainly has. There was a final flurry and some pretty late nights as we had that final tussle over some quite controversial pieces of legislation. So what happens is, of course, the government has a majority in the Commons, so it can do what it likes in there, but it doesn't in the House of Lords. So the House of Lords can make changes. So we've had this last-minute toing and froing as the Lords, critics of the government's legislation in the Lords at any rate, try to make these changes. They get overturned in the Commons, come back to the Lords. Now, sometimes the government will make some concessions to make sure the bill gets through before the deadline, which was Thursday, and does get into law. Not too many concessions this week. And in the end, even although there are plenty critics in the House of Lords of this legislation, they do often back down in the end because they're not elected and they feel it's really not right to stop the elected government getting its way on bills and legislation it feels very strongly about.
And there is a sort of understanding around that. One of the bills, most controversial probably amongst them, has been the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. There has been an ongoing fight between the two houses for over a year over that bill between the Commons and the Lords. What did happen in the end in the remaining stages?
Well, the remaining stages, the bill did get through in the end, but there was a good old row, one that has been rumbling on, just as you said, for months now, over the plans to curb protests and demos. In particular, people are very unhappy, or Labour's very unhappy, about the plans to curb noisy demos, making too much noise, banging your drums, shouting, singing. They say that is just a fundamental bit of democracy. The government say, yeah, that is true, but there have been some protests that have just gone on too long, gone too far, and that these new powers are definitely needed to make people's lives tolerable.
It cannot be the case that a protest can inflict any amount of noise on those living or working in the vicinity for prolonged periods of time, day or night. I agree it would not be necessary or proportionate, for example, to attach conditions relating to the generation of noise to procession, which will pass a particular location within a matter of hours. But the same cannot be said of an ongoing raucous protest, perhaps encamped in a residential area, which includes the banging of drums and the use of loud hailers.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we have indeed debated it several times. Members across this House have spoken passionately about why this really matters and why the government has got this so wrong. You might think, Madam Deputy Speaker, with crime up 40%, the arrest rate halved since 2010 and prosecution rates at an all-time low, that the government might spend its time on the bread and butter issues of law and order, fighting criminals. But instead they seem intent on criminalising singing at peaceful protests. It perhaps suggests that the government is tired, out of ideas and with no plan, searching around for anything eye-catching to distract from their years of failure. A noisy protest outside an office with double glazing may not meet the threshold in this legislation. This guidance is seriously asking the police to consider whether a protest is too noisy based on how many buildings around it have double glazed windows. How on earth will the police know?
Most importantly, they are the clauses people are concerned about because they are a threat to a right long held to have our voices heard. My office also receives hundreds of emails on a daily basis asking me to stand up against the threat to these rights. People are worried, and not just because of this bill in particular, although it's frankly terrifying, but because of the context in which it is being pushed through this place. This week sees the Elections Bill, the Nationality and Borders Bill, the Judicial Review and Courts Bill debated, each carrying their own threat to our fundamental rights. People know how this works now. They know that the government have seemingly unfettered powers to make any law they want.
The disruption caused, for example, by relatively low levels of noise, but that carry on for 24 hours a day, sometimes for days and days on end, where extremely loud noises are generated by the kind of portable amplification technology which has become available even to lone protesters today. Those things can cause enormous disruption.
We should all be able to take to the streets to express our views on the issues of the day, and in doing so it's inevitable that some will be offended, inconvenienced or put out. And we should all accept that as part of the debate. But we have all accepted, I think, on all sides of the House, that even in a protest situation, controls can and should be mandated, that this is not an unqualified right.
It's amazing, Susan, how much discussion we've had about the level of noisy protest and what is acceptable or not. But in the end, that bill, too, passed into law as well. Now, before we end today's programme, you mentioned earlier, Parliament proroguing on Thursday. Such a parliamentary term, isn't it? I think we can show, yes, we can show some pictures of that most parliamentary of procedures actually happening. Tell us a little bit, Susan, what's involved.
Yes, well, what's not to like about a few ermine robes and some tricorn hats that they do a bit of doffing on and off, and a little bit of Norman French, why not? La Reine le Vote, they say, which means the Queen wishes it, and that's when those last few bills pass into law, and it's the Queen's assent to these new laws is given. It's a kind of a mirror as well of the Queen's speech, because there is a government speech detailing all the things that they've done over the last year, over the past few months since the previous Queen's speech. And that's all before they pack up and leave for 10 days or so, until the Queen's speech, a lot more pomp and ceremony of that, a lot more robes and ermine, and it all starts again with a new session and more legislation and a new plan for government.
Thank you very much. That's all we've got time for this week. Politics UK will be back in 2 weeks' time. But I'll be back with Politics Live on Tuesday at 12:15. Until then, have a great weekend.